This is the 12th and final lesson of the Ruby on Rails tutorial screencasts, Following Users. In this lesson, we will complete the sample application by adding a social layer that allows users to follow and unfollow other users, resulting in each user's homepage displaying a status feed of the followed user's microposts. We'll start by learning how to model relationships between users, and then we'll build the corresponding web interface for following users and displaying the results. We'll end by developing a fully functional status feed, which involves some of the most challenging material in the tutorial, including a particularly tricky mix of Ruby and SQL. There are a lot of moving parts in this lesson, so I want to get started by giving a tour of the interface of what we're going to be developing. Let's take a look at some mock-ups of that. This is our goal for a user's profile. You can see that we've got a bunch of elements already implemented, including the Gravatar image and name, the number of microposts, and this list here of the user's microposts, including the delete links and pagination. But we're going to add these links here, 50 following, 77 followers. If you want to find a user to follow, you're going to be able to go to /users, which is just the user index page. So a user like John Calvin will come into the all users page, maybe click on Thomas Hobbes here, and go to Hobbes's profile page. That'll have all of the same elements as Calvin's profile page, but in addition it'll have a follow link, like this. So if Calvin clicks on follow, it will increment the number of followers that Hobbes has from 144 to 145, and will change that follow link to unfollow. After following Hobbes, Calvin can go to his home page, which includes a micropost feed, and those microposts now include the microposts of Hobbes. Of course, we've already implemented quite a few of these things, and we have partial implementations of a lot of it as well. But you can see once we're done, we'll have basically a minimalist Twitter clone, and getting to this point is the goal of this lesson. Underlying a lot of this new functionality will be relationships between users. Users like Calvin who are following Hobbes, and Hobbes who's being followed by Calvin. So our first step is to build a model to capture that relationship in code. Let's get started by checking out a branch. Now let's consider what we'd like our data model to look like. Let me open up a new Scratch window here, just to type in. So let's think about the relationships between these users. If Calvin follows Hobbes, that means Calvin is following Hobbes, and Hobbes is followed by Calvin. This suggests that Hobbes would have a collection of followers like this. We would expect Calvin to be among them. And meanwhile, Calvin, according to the usual pluralization conventions of Rails, would have followeds. That's because Calvin is following Hobbes, and Hobbes is followed by Calvin. But of course, linguistically, followeds is really strange. So we'll keep this followers convention, which sounds quite natural. But instead of writing followeds, we'll adopt Twitter's convention and write following. This is potentially confusing because in colloquial English usage, someone's following is actually the set of people following them. But of course, here we mean exactly the opposite. But I think at this point, because Twitter has popularized this usage, the meaning is clear enough. Let's start with this case of following. If you think about it, this means that Calvin has many users he's following, which suggests a has-many relationship. Let's review what we did in the last lesson in that context. So we can go here. This is what we did with user microposts. Remember that a user has many microposts, and as a result, there's this collection, user.microposts. So naively, you might think, well, we're going to have the same thing here. A user might have many users they're following. Here, each row in the following table has the follower ID, the followed ID, and then name, email address, and all the other information for the user. But if you think about this, it's incredibly redundant, because all of the information here is already in the users table. And indeed, going the other way, doing something like Hobbes.followers, would involve the same sort of redundancy. And finally, it's a maintenance nightmare, because if a user changed their name, say here, user2 changed their name, we would have to update that name everywhere in every table. So what we'd really like is to maintain the current users table the way it is, and have all this information be in only one place. This suggests that we're missing an underlying abstraction, and the way to figure it out is to think in terms of the REST architecture. Remember, the REST architecture involves resources that are created, updated, shown, destroyed, and so on. So what happens when one user follows another user? What's being created? Fundamentally, what's being created is a relationship between the two users. So in this section, what we're going to do is build a relationship model that captures that idea. Some websites have relationships between users that are symmetric. For example, Facebook, where users are friends, and if Calvin is friends with Hobbes, then Hobbes is also friends with Calvin. But these Twitter-style relationships are asymmetric. Absent some sort of blocking mechanism, Hobbes doesn't choose who follows him, but he does choose who he follows. So in this context, if Calvin is following Hobbes, but not vice versa, Calvin has an active relationship with Hobbes because he's actually taken action to do the follow, whereas Hobbes has a passive relationship with Calvin because he hasn't made any choice. The way we're going to model this is with what's called has-many-through. Let's take a look at that. This is modeling the idea of a user here named after me who's following a bunch of different users. So this is user.following over here with the IDs of the users. But this user.following collection is calculated through what's called a join table, in this case called active relationships, that has a list of all of the follower IDs and a list of all the followed IDs. So the way has-many-through works is for a particular user, it goes in and says, well, which of these active relationships have a follower ID equal to the current user's ID? And once it's made that list, it can then figure out what the user.following array should look like using has-many. Later on in this lesson, in order to construct user.followers, we'll have a corresponding passive relationships table. But if you think about it, that's going to be exactly the same information with just follower ID and followed ID reversed. As you might guess, Rails has a way of handling this. Indeed, what we're about to do is create a generic relationships table, and then we'll be able to switch between active relationships and passive relationships inside of the user model. So let's generate a model for those relationships. Take a look at a diagram here. We'll have the ID and the magic columns as usual, and then we'll have the follower ID and followed ID corresponding to these two columns here. Remember, it's singular though, Rails generate model relationship. Again, looking at our diagram, there are going to be two fields, a follower ID and a followed ID, each of which will be an integer. When we generated the micropost model, we used user ID references, and that automatically built part of the data model. But here, follower ID and followed ID both refer to users. So we're going to have to build the data model by hand. We're going to have to tell Rails in particular which class this corresponds to. Let's take a look at the migration. We're actually going to make a couple changes. So this is fine so far as it goes, but we're going to be finding by follower ID and followed ID, and in fact the combination of the two should be unique, right? A user shouldn't be able to follow a user twice, and all of those requirements suggest a database index. As we saw in the micropost migration right here, we can add an index on a particular column just by writing index true, like this, and then we want a multiple key index on both of them, enforcing uniqueness. So that was this here, maybe? Yeah. So we want a combination of this add index, to users. No, this is actually to the relationships table, right? And we want it to be composite, so a combination of follower ID and followed ID. We saw this before. Where was it? Right here. So we combined a bunch of different things from previous migrations to make this one. And so this line will arrange for an error to arise if, for any reason, we try to create a duplicate relationship. Let's save the file here and run the migration. Before implementing user following and followers, we first need to link users with relationships. Let's look at our diagram again. Here the relationship between the user and user.following is has many through active relationships. So that means that a user has many active relationships, and conversely, each of these relationships belongs to a user. Indeed, it belongs to a follower and to a followed user. So this record, for example, would belong to this user and would also belong to the followed user, in this case, over here. Let's take a look at the user model. And we also want to look at the newly generated relationship model. So here at the top we've got has many microposts. So we're going to do this, has many. Now you might think we're going to do has many relationships, but remember we're modeling two different kinds of relationships, these active relationships and passive relationships. So we're starting with active. So we're going to do has many active relationships. But this won't work by default because this here, has many microposts, tells Rails to look for a class called micropost. And that does exist. Right, there's a micropost model right here. But there's no active relationship model. Instead, there's a relationship model. So what we need to do is tell Rails the name of the class with an argument here. Class name relationship. In addition, over here with the micropost model, you might recall that there was a user ID to link the users to microposts. But now we have two different IDs. We have follower ID and followed ID. As I mentioned briefly in the last lesson, the user ID in the micropost table is called a foreign key. In this case, the foreign key will depend on whether we're talking about active relationships or passive relationships. Let's take a look at the diagram again. In order to make the user.following collection, we need this active relationships, and in this case, what identifies this user is in this column here, the follower ID column. So that's the foreign key in this context. That's the thing that links this user to this table. So here we need to tell Rails this is the class name relationship and foreign key follower ID. In this case here, we didn't have to tell Rails the name of the foreign key because by default it's just based on the user class. So a user model corresponds to a user ID. But in this case, follower does not correspond to a model, so we have to tell Rails explicitly. And finally, if the user is destroyed, any relationship should also be destroyed. So let's make this dependent destroy. Meanwhile, in the relationship model, we want the analog of this belongs to user. So we can do that here. We want belongs to follower. That tells us which user is the follower here, so it goes back through this association. But in micropost, when we said belongs to user, Rails knew by convention that that referred to the user model. Here, there is no follower model, so we have to tell Rails which class it is. And even though we won't need it right away, the symmetric case of followed is convenient to implement now. Just do this followed. Let's take a look at a table of some of the things this gives us. For any relationship, there's a follower and a followed right here. Corresponds to this. This would be the follower, and this would be followed. We can also create and build relationships through the association, as we did with microposts. Now there's a lot going on here, so don't worry if this is a little confusing right now. We'll be covering it in more detail when we build the web interface later in this lesson. Before moving on, let's add a couple simple validations to the relationship model. We can start with some tests. We've seen this before a couple times now. create a new relationship, it needs a follower ID and a followed ID. We can just pick any IDs here because we're not actually going to save this relationship. Let's do our usual sanity check. And then check that both the follower ID and followed ID are required. So these will be presence validations. These should be red. In fact, they're really red. If you look here, it says active record, record not unique. We saw this back in lesson 6 in the context of the user model. When we required email uniqueness at the database level, the user's fixtures broke the test because they're not unique by default. So the same thing had just happened here. And we'll use the same solution, which is just to make it empty for now. We'll fill this in later in this lesson. Save this again. It should be red for a different reason. The way I could tell, by the way, is not only that there were 3 of them, but they're errors. And what we want to do is get to failures. So these errors were exceptions being raised here. Active record not unique. Now we've got 2 failures corresponding to these here. So we just need to put 2 presence validations in here. Great. We can also double check to make sure our full test suite is green. Good, and now we're ready to start modeling following and followers. To set up user.following, which will return all of the followed users, we're going to use a has-many association. We saw this before with microposts, but in this case it's going to be has-many through the active relationships. It's right here. The syntax is similar to what we had before with has-many microposts, like this. Now naturally, in terms of the ID, which is followed ID here, we would get user.followeds, which as noted before is unnatural in English, so instead we're going to follow Twitter's convention and say user.following. So we'll say has-many following through active relationships. This has-many we just made. Now in the case of microposts, Rails knew to look for a foreign key called user ID because of the class user here. So that's what would happen here by default as well, but because it's called followed ID instead of user ID, as we saw here, we need to tell Rails what the source is. So the way to do that is source followed. One of the best ways to see the effect of this association is to write some tests. One of the great things about tests in this context is that they act as a client for the code. Because we're pretty far from having a web interface for this, and it's easy to get lost in all the abstraction. But the test code is nice and concrete, so let's take a look at it. Let's say test should follow and unfollow a user. So now what we want to do is write some tests that a user is not following another user, then have that user follow the second user, and then check to see that the following relationship has been established. In this context, it's convenient to introduce some utility methods, which of course we'll have to write. So let's define a couple of users. let's call them Michael and Archer. Again, I'm just pulling these out of the user's fixtures. Just the first two here. And initially, let's say that Michael is not following Archer. So let's say assert not. And now I'm going to just make up a kind of utility method that I would like. Michael.following as a Boolean, so question mark, Archer. And then let's plan to write follow and unfollow utility methods to create and destroy these relationships. So Michael.follow Archer. And at this point, the user Michael should be following Archer. So assert this. And let's unfollow Archer. And now this should be true again, so should assert not following. You can save that. It's going to complain here, of course, because these methods don't exist yet. Let's go to the user model. These are methods here, like following question mark and follow and unfollow are methods on the user instance here. So let's put it here in the user model. Start with a follow utility, so this follows the user. It's going to follow another user here, so let's say other user. And let's think about what this is going to be. So this is going to create an active relationship where the followed ID is this other user's ID. You can look back at our table. Remember, we can create a relationship through the association like this. So let's use that. The followed ID will be other user.id. The converse of that, I can just copy this actually. I'm going to do unfollow. This unfollows a user. And in this case, we're going to find by where the followed ID is the other user's ID. This will return the object, and then we'll call destroy on it. You might wonder, where's the follower ID in all this? And the answer is it's implicit, because we know which user these methods are being called on. And indeed, if you look up here, it's basically because of this association here. Because the foreign key is follower ID, that's the user's ID in this context. So looking at this diagram, the follower ID is always just the current user's ID. So finally, we can do this. Here's our following question mark Boolean. And now we could find the relationship and see if it exists. But there's an even nicer way to do it. Actually, let's do it that way. Let's do it that way first, and then we can refactor it. Active relationships.find by followed ID is the other user .id. So if this exists, if this is not nil, then following question mark is true. So we can say bang.nil question mark. So this is nil if the user isn't following the other user, and then we negate it here with the bang. So let's save that. We might even be green. Nope. Oh, wrong number of arguments here. Right, because the following question mark method needs to take an other user. So let's just do that. That's pretty obvious. Ah, now we are green. Great. I just mentioned, though, that there's a more elegant way to do this here. Because of this association up here has many following, there's a user.following. Remember, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get this user.following. So inside the object itself inside this model, we can do self.following. That's that collection of users that this user is following. We can treat this like an array. In particular, we can call the include question mark method on it and see if this other user is in that list. You can see we're still green. And of course, as usual, unless we're doing an assignment like down here, we can omit this self dot. I included it here just because we have user.following here, so that's the structure. This is user.following, but inside the model we can just do following. And that's it. We can now create a following relationship using this follow method and destroy that relationship using unfollow. So this is a working backend now for the user following and unfollowing. Of course, we'd like to be able to go the other way, which is to have, in addition to this user.following, also have user.followers. In other words, we want to be able to have a passive relationships join table that will say has many through user.followers. So we can do that here. This is just the reverse. Using this data model, you can see it's the same as active relationships here in the join table, just with followed ID and follower ID reversed, like this. Oops, we can do these two here. So here what Rails will do is look for the followed ID here in this column, which we can then match up with the follower ID in the second column. And from that, we can infer the collection user.followers to return a list of all the users that are following the given user. The implementation is almost exactly the same, just reversing some things. So we can do, actually just copy both of these here, just copy and say has many passive relationships. Again, we need a class name relationship because there is no passive relationship model. Instead of the follower ID being the foreign key, it's now the followed ID. And then we have has many following through passive relationships, source follower. Let's take a look at the failing test there. Line 81, that's this here. That's weird. Why did that fail? Oh, it's because we didn't change has many following to has many followers. So our test actually caught something that broke. That's good. Okay, we're back to green. And so if we believe this parallel structure actually worked, which we might if we look at this diagram, has many followers through passive relationships, this should work. So an easy way to test that is to go in here, and in addition to saying assert Michael.following question mark Archer, we can borrow from this here, this following, and say that Archer's followers should include Michael. Save that and see if we're still green. Alright, so now we've got a test for the passive relationships as well as for the active relationships. By the way, at this point, you could actually implement something like a followed by question mark method to complement this method. It turns out we won't actually need that in the implementation, but it wouldn't be a terrible idea. So believe it or not, this completes the data modeling. Let's take a look at our test suite, make sure it's green. Okay, this test here, it's not very long, but it really tests a lot of this data modeling here. Pretty much anything changed here will break something, so we could do this. Follower IDs will break. If we change this to a relationship, it breaks. So this is a really nice sensitive test of these has many through associations. This is quite abstract though, so I think it'll become a lot clearer once we build the web interface that lets users follow each other. To get a sense of where we're going with the web interface for following users, let's take another look at the mockups from the beginning of the lesson. So here's a profile page, a page for all users, and then this is another user. So if John Calvin is logged in and visit Thomas Hobbes's profile page, he should see this follow link. Unless he's already following Hobbes, in which case he should see an unfollow link. So this is the first part of the interface we want to build, including this form here and also this little area that has the statistics. To get started with that, as usual, it's always nice to have some sample data when making an interface. So let's open up our seeds.rb. This is getting long enough that I'm going to put in some comments indicating what each section does. This is for users, this here is for microposts. And now we're going to add some code for creating following relationships. The exact details here are somewhat arbitrary, but what we're going to do is just create enough following relationships to create the interface. So let's start by selecting all the users in the database. And let's pick out the first one. And let's say the followed users will be with index 2 up to 50. So user 0, which is this one here, the one we just picked out, will end up following users with index 2 up to 50. And that user's followers, we'll say, are users 3 up to 40. So now for each of these users to be followed, we want to call user.follow. And likewise for the followers. Each follower should follow the user. Then we reset the database and seed it as usual. I've shortened the sequence there, but don't be alarmed. That can take quite a bit of time to create the sample data, especially all these following relationships. At this point, we're ready to make that stats area. Let's take a look at this. This is this area here. I've got a close-up here. So we're going to make this, and we're going to make the follow form right here. Because we plan to put those stats on both the profile page and the home page, we should put them in a partial. Should be in the shared directory. Let's go here. App views shared. Let's call it stats. Let's put it in a div with class stats. And now let's take a look at the mockup again. So this should be a link to the following, and this should be a link to the followers. We don't actually have those routes defined yet, so let's stub it out for now. And then inside this link, let's have the count, like this, and then a label. So let's put it in the strong tag with class following, actually ID following, and class stat. I actually don't know if this is going to work. Let's check it out. No, it didn't. So we can do this, and then class stat, and this should be the following count. So remember, we have this, say a current user dot following. Of course, this will only work for logged in users and will only really apply to the home page and the user's own profile page. So we'll fix this up in just a moment, but let's start off with this. Current user dot following dot count. As with counting the microposts through the association, this is smart. Rails calculates this in the database and then returns the result. So it's very efficient. And we can say following. And then have the same sort of thing for the followers. So let's call this the followers ID. Also a stat class, and this should be followers. Let's render this on the home page to start off with. It's going to be after the user info, but before the micropose form. So let's do this section. Class stats. And we can render. Shared stats. And let's check it out. So we have to log in. Go to the home page, and there it is. It's not styled yet, but it's shown up. That's pretty cool. So let's put the CSS in. This is going to go in the sidebar CSS, which is right here. So let's just add it to the bottom of that, right before this forms part. And as I often have, I'm just going to copy this from the tutorial. Copy into the sidebars area. So it starts with this stats down to users.follow. Paste that in. Oops, I guess I missed that closing brace, didn't I? Yep. Okay. Let's take a look at this, refresh it. Nice. If I mouse over it, yeah, it changes color. That's great. Now let's put the stats on the user profile page. That's show. Same thing, we can render stats partial right here after the name. So this after this section. So let's go to the profile. There it is again. But of course this only works for this user. If we go to a different user, it's the stats for the current user. That's not what we want at all though. So if we go here, what we want is to use the current user only if there's not already an @user. So remember, in the user's controller, there's this @user equals user.find of params of ID. So that comes out of here, this 5 here in the URL. But this page is currently using the current user that's logged in rather than user 5. So we want to use @user if it exists, otherwise use current user. So let's define @user. This is embedded Ruby, but we're not actually inserting this into the template, so we don't need an equal sign here. So this is going to be, the user is going to be, well, let's use @user if it exists, but if that isn't defined, then it'll be nil, and we can say or current user. This may look familiar. We saw this in the sessions helper. This here, @current user or equals user.findBy, is exactly the same kind of construction we have here. So this can be replaced with or equals current user, like that. And then instead of current user, we can say @user. Save that, and now it should change right here. There it is, one following, one followers. By the way, it's okay to have plural followers here, even though there's only one, because this is a label. Instead of saying one followers, this is saying followers one. So that's why we didn't use the pluralized method in this case. Now that the stats are basically working, let's fill in these links here, these hrefs, to the following user path and the followers user path. So you might guess that involves editing the routes file. So what we'd like to do here is put in some embedded Ruby and say following user path of @user. And this should return something like /user/1/following. So this is going to be the page for the users being followed. Again, we can look at the mock-up here. That's over here. Here it should be, here's following. Yeah. So we want to link to this page, which means creating a route that has the user's ID in it. So we want it to be something like this. /users, let's go here. /user/1/following. Compare this to /user/1/edit. Right. So we want this to be following, and this will return the users that user 1 is following. And the way to do that is using what's called the member method. It works like this. Give a block to resources users, and then we can say member do, responding to get requests, get following, and followers. This is the kind of thing you can just read about if you go to Google and type something like Rails routing, or look at the footnote in the Rails tutorial. You'll see that this is how to make a URL of this form. Or rather, it's how to make a route that gives you that kind of URL. By the way, if you wanted something that didn't have the ID, if you just wanted /user/tigers, something like that, you would define it like this, with collection. But we don't need that, because there are no tigers here. Well, except in the mockups. So this gives us this following user path, and it also gives us a followers user path. We can paste that in here. And of course, we're going to have to define actions and views for these. But this will give us the route. Save that and take a look. Actually, save this here. Refresh it and see if we mouse over, what do we get? You can see here in the bottom left, /user/1/following, so it worked. If we go back to that other user, or another user, here's this one here, we've now got this stat partial working. All we need to complete our mockup is to put a follow form or an unfollow form. These forms will be creating and destroying relationships, but they're going to be accessed through the user's resource here, this user's controller. So it's convenient to define the forms themselves in the user's view directory. So that's an app views users. And we'll define them as partials and then render them on the user show page. So let's make a follow form here. Again, the leading underscore because it's a partial. And take a look at this. Actually, let's make the unfollow form too while we're at it. Now this is a little tricky. This is a form for creating a new relationship. So that means we need, in this follow form, a new active relationship object in memory. Remember from our table, we can get that using build here. So in this case, it's the current user. I'm going to do this. Form for current user dot active relationships dot build, and the followed ID will be the user on this page, so that's @user, that user's ID. So this is absolutely the kind of thing you might very well not have figured out. It might take some experimentation to get it working. In fact, there's a mistake here. There we go. But you can work an analogy with things like the sign-up form. Here we have form for @user, and this @user is from the user's controller. It's right here. So this is the equivalent of saying current user.activerelationships.new except in this case it's build, and then we have to give it the followed ID in order to make the association. And then in analogy with this here, there's going to be a form variable, do f. Let's take a look at the mockup. So there's just a submit button. There's no other text. Go here. We can say f.submit follow, and then give it the classes that we use to style it. And these are from Bootstrap. So now think about what this is going to do in terms of the routing. This here, this form for a new user, is routed via the routes here to the user's resource. In particular, it gets routed because of resources users to the create action here, because it's a post request. So this here is going to issue a post request not to the user's controller, but because this is a relationship, to the relationships controller. That controller doesn't exist yet. We're about to create it, but we can make the route right now. We can add the resource for relationships right here. And we're only going to be creating and destroying them. But I also noticed that there's some cruft here, some extra stuff that came from generating things. We don't need any of those. Let's save that. And this will now give us the route that will respond to this request. This will be clear once we render this on a page. In fact, let's see how that works. Let's make a follow form for users. So this is going to be either the follow form or the unfollow form, depending on whether the user is following the other user. So if, we'll use our following question mark helper, if the current user is following the user whose profile this is, so that's @user, that's if this is true, then we should render the unfollow form. This is render unfollow, else render the follow form. And then we can go to the show page, and inside here, let's render it right above the microposts. So render follow form. Save this and save this, and let's find a user that's not being followed. So actually this user isn't being followed, so it should work. There we go, there's the follow form at the top. And you can see that the action is /relationships, and that route here that we just made, that'll be routed to the create action in the relationships controller, which we'll generate in a moment. Let's take a look at our tests. You can see we've got an error here. Undefined method following question mark for nil class. So where is that coming from? It's coming from here. So this nil class means that current user is nil. And that's true. If we look here in the follow form, there has to be a current user. But of course, this doesn't exist if the user isn't logged in. So we should only render this follow form if the user is logged in. Go here, if logged in. You can see our tests are useful, even though we haven't actually specifically tested that. It still caught something. That's good. There's something else weird going on. If we look at this follow form, think about what's happening if we submit this. In the create action for the relationship, we're going to have to find the followed user, just like we did here in the create action. There's going to be strong parameters. Here it was name, email, password, password confirmation. We're going to have something similar in the relationships controller, but right now there's no way to transmit that information from the form. This object knows the followed ID, but there's no way that that can propagate all the way to the controller. So what we have to do is the same thing that we did in lesson 10, where we had an email on the password resets form. So let's see where that was. That was here. We needed a hidden tag. So we can do the same thing here. Let's put it in a div. Say div hidden field tag. Followed ID, and just @user ID. And you know what I've realized is we don't actually need this. We do not need the followed ID here. We actually don't need that ID just to create this thing in memory. We never actually use that information when making the form. Okay, so now this is the exact analog of doing this here. User.new. Now it's current user.activerelationships.build. So remember, build is basically the same as new. And then we've got this hidden field that will propagate the user to be followed, and then we can pull it out with params of followed ID. Let's make the unfollow form now. Just copy this. It's going to be quite similar. Now what we're going to do is find the relationship between these users using current user.activerelationships.findBy at user.id. Oh, and that's the followed ID. And then this is to destroy the relationship, so we need to tell it its method delete. The way to do that is like this. It's part of the HTML, so we need to give it HTML as the key, and then the value is the hash method delete. You've seen that before. It's right here in the micropost form. So here we've got HTML multipart true, and now we're doing HTML method delete. So we've also seen method delete a couple times. Right, so we've got this link to here, for example. And in this case, we don't need the followed ID in the hidden field, because this here, this form, this is for a relationship that already exists. But I think we need to know closing paren here. Yeah. So when we submit this form, it will go to the destroy action of the relationships controller, and this here will give us the ID of the relationship, which we can then find in the database and destroy. So we don't need this here. This should be unfollow. And let's take a look at it. There's one more change we're going to make. Let's look at a user that's being followed. I think user 5 was being followed. Yeah. Well, for one, I should change this from unallow to unfollow. But here you can see that the color is the same. And it's actually nice. We can just get rid of this button primary. I'll make it gray instead of blue. There we go. So if we look at this form, you can see there's a form for editing a relationship, and the reason that Rails knows to do that is because this relationship already exists. Remember, we saw this back with this edit form for users. Here's the method is delete. That's from this here. And it has the ID, action equals /relationship /3, so this is the ID that identifies the relationship between the current user that's logged in and user 5. This will become clearer in a couple sections when we actually get these forms working. But for now, the front end is working. We've got these stats here on the home page, the profile page. On the users page, there's just one more thing. You might have noticed it actually just now. On the user's own profile page, there's no reason to have this follow button, so we should add something in there. In the follow form, we can say unless current user !@user. So what happened here is the current user is the same as user 1. This is what gives rise to @user. This is in here. User.find of params of ID, which is 1 in this case, but that's also current user, so we should say unless current user !@user using our current user boolean, then render the follow form. Save that, and there we go. So this is a pretty typical sequence. We've made some sample data, we've built the front end, and now we need to make the back end, so that means getting the following and followers pages to work and getting these forms to work, these follow and unfollow forms. Let's start with the following and followers pages. You can take a look at the mockups for those. So that's this here and this here. You can see they're really similar, and in fact we'll define an underlying view for both of them. It won't actually be a partial though, as we'll see. But first we'll do a little access control. You certainly need to be logged in to see these pages. So let's write some tests. User controller test. Users controller, I should say. So we can do this and say get following with the ID @user, and then we should be redirected to the root URL. Just copy this here. Actually, that's not true. We should be redirected to the login URL, right? And then same thing for followers. Oops, I doubled that up, didn't I? Followers, when not logged in, followers. It should be red. There are actually errors here because the followers and following action don't exist. We're going to need this though, we might as well put them in. So let's go to the users controller, here they are. We're going to put these right at the end. Now we're missing the template. We are going to define that template in a moment, but all we need to do to get these tests to pass is to add following and followers to the list of actions protected by the logged in user before filter. So we can do this. Now we should be green. All right. Now because these two pages are almost identical, we're actually going to make a non-partial for them and then render that template. So it's going to be called show follow. It's going to be the same thing here. And that template will take in a title. We'll say @title, in this case, is following. And down here will be followers. And here we'll have a user from the params. It's actually going to be the same user in here. We could put this in a before filter. Doesn't really seem like it's worth the effort here. And then there are going to be a bunch of users here on the side, right here. So this is going to be on the following page. These are going to be the users that are being followed, and here it'll be the followers. So let's put those in instance variables called @users. It's going to be @user.following. And you can see we've got pagination links here, so we're going to paginate these. As usual, this will just magically work. We've got this complicated association, but the pagination will work through the association automatically. This is the same thing, except instead of following, it's followers. And these are all the variables we need, and we just need to make the template. Let's do that here. Oops, I need to give it the extension. The title will be given by this @title. So we can just do this here. As usual, let's provide title and then @title. And then there's just a bunch of structure, so I'll type it in pretty quickly. It's not that important, the details here. Got the user info. If you want, you can actually define some partials for these. This stage is probably not that important, though. Surprisingly hard to get the exact partials you might want. If there are any users, we're going to render these here, side. I'm going to link to each user. We're going to make them small, these gravatars. It's just going to be the gravatar. That's what these represent here. These little images on the side. So let's do link to gravatar for user size 30. And a link to the user path of user. See what that looks like. Save this, save this. And we can go to here. Let's look at give us the stats partial. All right, syntax error. It's good to look at this early on. We're missing an end somewhere. Oh, it's the if @user.any right here. That's after the div. We want to do this here. I usually put the end in right away, and this is why. All right, that's looking good. So this is pretty close to this mockup right here. All we need is the stuff in the middle here. So let's do that. my lesson there. And here we're using the underscore user partial. Remember, we did render at users before. This iterates through the collection automatically because each of these is of class user. Rails looks for an underscore user partial. And so this should just work. Let's take a look. All right. Only one thing left, which is pagination. Do that. And because these are users and we're in the user's controller, we can just do will paginate without any argument. All right, it's working. You can see /1/following page 2. And of course we can look at the followers as well. Oops, it's the same URL though, look at that. That's a bug. Let's fix that. That's in the stats partial. So over here, you probably noticed that, but I missed it. This should be followers user path. Ah, there we go. /user/1/followers. And of course, all of these are linked too. You can click on one of those. I almost clicked on this. It doesn't work yet though. Following and followers are both working. Great. And you can see the delete links here, and that's because I'm an admin, or I'm logged in as an admin. It looks like there's some space that should be put in here. Micropost 50. Let's put that in. Yeah, I just need a space. Great. Check the profile link. Hope that's not working either. Did I just forget that? Yeah, I did. There it is. It can either be current user or at user. It actually doesn't matter. But we set it up here, right? This is always... Actually, no, it does matter, because we can look at the profiles of other people and look at the followers of other people. So we could go here, click on this. Right, so we definitely want it to be at user and not current user. So view my profile. This is now not my profile, the logged in user, but rather the profile of this particular user. There's one more thing, which is that this here, this space here is not quite right. So let's fix that. But I figured this out. It's actually an error in the book, which has now been fixed. It's in the CSS here, or that's the hint. It gives us the hint of what's going on. There's a rule here, .users.follow. So this is for something that has class users, which we get on things like this. Right? This has class users, this list. But there's this extra padding on the left here. So for something of class follow as well, we have padding 0. The problem is that on the show follow template, we just have class equals users, so it should be class users and follow. So if we do this, go back here, this should now work. Right. Now that we've got this working, let's write a couple of short tests to verify the behavior. We'll generate an integration test for following. This will be called following test. Let's take a look at it. There it is, and let's do a little setup. What I want is an at user as usual. And let's log in as that user. And then let's test the following page and the followers page. In fact, they'll be really similar. We can probably just copy this one. So let's get following user path of at user. And let's verify that the following count appears on the page and that links to all of the users being followed appear as well. So remember what we've been doing with something like a count. Instead of specifying the HTML tag using assert select, we've been doing assert match. That count.toS to make a string, and then that should be somewhere on the body. Again, response.body is the whole HTML, although in this case it actually is inside the body tag. And then for each of the users being followed, so at user.following.each, assert select should be an anchor tag with href equal to the user path of user. Remember, inside the test in this context, we can't actually just use user by itself. I'll save that and see what happens. So if we get rid of this here, see that it doesn't quite work. Oh, it did work. So I don't think it does work in general. In fact, in order to avoid a spurious passing like this, we should probably do something like this. So what happened here is we haven't set up the fixtures to have user following. Yeah, so there's a failure here. I'm going to leave this in because I think it's going to fail once we set up the associations. So let's set up the fixtures to actually make these tests do something useful. Remember with the microposts, we saw that we could build the association like this. So here's a micropost with the key orange, and we can just say user Michael like that. We're going to do the same thing inside the relationships YAML file. We don't really care what the names of these things are, so let's just call them 1 through 4. So 1 will be an association between Michael, who will be the follower. Michael will be following Lana. So followed is Lana. And let's do second one. Let's say Michael will follow Mallory. Just review who these are. So here's Lana and Mallory. So 2 will be, just copy this. I think I did copy it actually. Yeah. Followed will be Mallory. And then 3, let's say that Lana is following Michael. We can just do this here. And say that Archer is also following Michael. Save this, and now go back to the test. Here it is. Right, so now instead of having a failure, we have an error, and that's because of this thing here that I mentioned before. This should be user path of user. Doesn't work in the test, but now we should be green. All right. Let's test the followers page in the same way. We can just copy this thing or cut it. That'll work. Just paste twice. And now we want to get followers user path. Assert that this is not empty. Assert that the followers count appears. And then at user.followers. Oops. Right. I have test following page. It should be test followers page. All right. Now we're green. Rerun the full test suite. Great, so now we're done with the following and followers pages. At this point, we're ready to get that follow button to work. This is right here if we go to, say, this profile page. So here's the unfollow button, and similarly, we've got like a follow button here. Yeah, so we want to get these to work. You certainly have to be logged in to use these, so let's put some access control on the relationships controller. Of course, that involves first generating it, so let's do that. Oops. And we can open up the test. And as is often the case with our create and destroy protection, we're going to assert that there's no difference in a particular count, in this case the relationship count, and also assert that we're redirected to the login URL. So test create should require logged in user. Where did we do this before? We've been doing test should redirect the thing, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to say test should redirect create when not logged in. Doesn't really matter, but it's nice to be consistent here. And we can see here our assert no difference. Assert no difference in relationship count. We'll post to create. And the same thing for destroy. Oh, I forgot the redirect there, didn't I? So redirected to root URL, or no, login URL. So this is delete destroy, and it needs an ID to make the route properly. It doesn't matter which ID because we're not actually going to be destroying anything, but it needs to be a real ID to get the route to work. So let's pull something out of the fixtures. Relationships of 1 will work. Save that and see if we're green. Nope, there's something wrong here. What are we doing here? Oh yeah, did the same thing here. Should redirect destroy. 2 errors. Right. This is good. It should be red. We don't have any access control on this controller yet, so let's do the same thing we did before. We can add or not add these actions actually, but I like to add them now. Create and destroy. Save it. It should go from errors to a different kind of error. So it was before an error because the controllers or the actions weren't there. Now it's because the templates aren't there. So at this point we can put in this filter. Before action, logged in user, only create and destroy. Of course, there are only 2 actions here, so we could just leave this blank. In fact, I'm going to do that. We don't need to specify it. These are the only actions we're going to have, so we can just protect the whole thing. There we go, and now we're correctly redirecting to the login URL. And now let's check to see if these are working. I'm going to put in a debugger in the create action. So this is if you follow a user. Alright, so let's go over here, and this is going to create a new relationship, so that should have stopped it. In the debugger, there it is. Let's look at params. You can see params of followed ID. That's what's going to give us the user to follow. So this is working. That means our little form here, this follow form, actually gave us the right kind of form to create a new user, and I was right. We could get rid of that ID stuff. We just need current user.activerelationships.build to create a new relationship object. And then this hidden field is what created this params of followed ID. So we can do this. Right. So we can fill this out now. Just do this. So what is involved in creating this relationship? Well, we need to pull out the user. And then we want the current user to follow that user. And we're guaranteed to have a current user because of this before action here, the before filter. So current user.follow user, and then redirect back to the same profile. Redirect to user. Do Control D to release the debugger here. See what happens. That worked. Look at that. The followers incremented. And now this user should be one of the followed users, right? Following here. There it is. Macy Gleason is on the list. Of course, unfollow doesn't work. Let's get that working. Put the debugger in again. So now, params of ID, it's right here. Let's look that up. It's a relationship. And there it is. This is the relationship between follower ID 1 and followed ID 2. Recall from the diagram. These are the two columns, so this is follower ID 1, followed ID 2. In fact, it's exactly what we have here. It's great. So all we need to do is destroy that relationship. And there are actually two ways to do it. Let's go here, get rid of the debugger. Save this. So in here we want to do, well, there are a couple things we could do. We could actually find that relationship like this. This is one way to do it. We could do this, and then we could destroy it, and then redirect to relationship dot followed. I think this will work. Let's take a look. Yeah, that worked. But it's not symmetric with the create action. I like the idea of unfollowing the user. Remember, we have an unfollow helper, or unfollow method on the user model. So instead of doing this, we can do this. I think this is just slightly clearer. We can invoke the followed here, dot followed, and then say current user dot unfollow. We need to bind this to a user, so user equals that, and then redirect to user. Same thing, so if you click this twice, to just toggle. And there it is, it's working. So this is pretty great. Our follow and unfollow buttons are working just fine. You can see it increments the count here, decrements it when I click again. But you might reasonably ask, since we're starting and ending on the same page, why do we even need to leave it? Why can't we just make this change on this page? And the answer is there is a way to do that using what's called AJAX. So as a final refinement to this follow and unfollow functionality, let's make it possible to change the button and change the count over here without ever leaving this page. The first step is really easy. All we need to do is to go to the form here and just add remote true. Same thing on the unfollow form. here, you just add remote true. Save that. Take a look at the form. Actually, we need to reload this, don't we? I can just reload here. It's easier to inspect it again. Now in the form you can see there's an extra attribute, data remote true. This attribute tells Rails to allow this form to be handled by JavaScript. In particular, we're going to be able to use JavaScript to update this button and update the followers count without ever leaving the page. In order to get that to work, we have to arrange for the relationships controller to respond to AJAX requests. Let's take a look at that. It's right here. The trick is to use something called respond to. The first two lines here are the same, and then we can say respond to, and then depending on the format that the page expects as a response, we can do one or another thing. So if it's HTML, which is what we currently have, we should redirect to the user. In fact, this will work exactly the same. We can do this here. It's the same code. So this doesn't change anything. This form will still work. Click here. I think it'll work. Okay, so the reason it's not working here is because I have JavaScript enabled in my browser, and so Rails is expecting something to respond to a JavaScript request. But what's cool is that this sort of design degrades gracefully, so if I shut off JavaScript, which I don't want to do because I'm sure Cloud9 relies on it, but if I were to disable it, this button would work just the same as it did before I put in remote true in here and in the enfollow form. So let's get this to work. We need to respond to not just an HTML request, but also to a JavaScript request. The syntax is a little weird. It looks like both of these things will be executed. This is the way to do it. But in fact, each of these lines is kind of like an if, then, else. It's like respond to do format. If it's this one, then do that. If it's a JavaScript request, then do something. We'll see in a second what that is, but it's exactly the same down here. I can just copy and paste. So what does this do? Suppose that I issue a JavaScript request, which is what happens here, because I have JavaScript enabled in this browser. What happens in here? And the answer is similar to what happens when you just visit a page or visit an action. It tries to render, in general, a template corresponding to the name of the action. In this case, it tries to evaluate a file corresponding to this create action ending in the extension .js.erb. So that's a JavaScript embedded Ruby file. That means we need to create those files. They go in the relationships directory here in app views relationships. So this is the convention. Inside a create action, format.js will try to render this, and then we can do the same thing for destroy. Oops, that wasn't what I wanted to do. Now inside these files, these JS.erb files, we actually have access to a powerful JavaScript library called jQuery. jQuery has, among other things, a syntax that lets you pick out an ID from the page. So if we look at the follow form here, you can see that we have an ID here. Remember that the hash sign can be used to access that in, say, CSS or inside of tests. So in jQuery, it's a $sign and then hash sign the ID. So this lets us grab this element here, this div. What we want to do here is insert, well, which form is this? This is the create a new following relationship. So after this executes, the user will be following the other user, so instead of a follow form, this should be an unfollow form. So what we can do is we can use the HTML method, to replace the contents of this here with the unfollow form. And because this is JS-ERB, we can embed Ruby like this. Well, let me show you what you might guess. You might say, well, it's render users unfollow. Because this is happening in the relationships controller, we have to put in user slash here. So you might guess this. Let's see what happened there. I can try submitting this thing. Oh, that actually went through. So let's go to a user that is not being followed. So you can see I clicked there, but it didn't actually change the form. And that's because it's trying to insert this HTML, but that's not valid inside of JavaScript. So we actually have to escape it out. We do that with the escape JavaScript method. If it seems like this is probably pretty hard to debug, you're right. This is really nasty. Sometimes you can get some help by looking at the inspector like this. Let's try that again. I just refresh it. You can see it actually did work. It just didn't update the form. So let's review what happened there. I clicked on the follow button, and it actually did go to the relationships controller. It found this line, but it executed these two lines first. So what happened is that the current user did follow the given user. The problem is it just didn't update the form properly. So let's pick another user that isn't being followed, so try this one. Nope, still not working. Let's see, it looks like there might be an error here. Undefined method ID for nil class. Oh, this is actually progress though. It's complaining inside of the unfollow form, so that's here. Right, so it's trying to make this form, and the problem is there's no @user. This is the problem. You can see the problem traces to line 7 here in the relationships controller, so let's look at that. It's right here. Yes, and you can see that this is just a regular user, so let's make it an @user. We didn't need it to be an @user before, but now we do. Let's save that and see if it's working. Again, if we refresh this, it'll actually go to unfollow because the follow is happening. It's just not being updated on the form. Let's go back again. This might work. Let's see. All right. So that was a successful AJAX request there. You might note that it didn't update this followers count. So let's make another line here. Again, we can pick out the followers that's in the stats partial. It's right here. That's going to be this ID, followers. We want to increment that. And actually, all we need is just to put in the followers count. So let's pull out the ID of that element. Or we're going to pull out the element using the ID, rather. So followers, and the study.html just replaces what's inside this element with the argument here. And that's just going to be the user's count. So this is actually just this. Just copy this here. Save that and see if that works. So to keep an eye on this part here. There it worked. Look at that. So now all we need is the corresponding destroy action, and then we can toggle back and forth. We just copy and paste and change this to follow. This is still follow form. And the second line is still the same as well. We're just replacing this ID's contents with the updated count. So if we save this and then refresh this, we should be able to just click here, follow, unfollow, follow. Look at that. So this is working. It's hitting the server using AJAX, but it's not doing a full request loop. Pretty cool. Let's log in using Opera and disable JavaScript, see what happens. Turn off JavaScript, refresh this page, go to the, oh, I need to log in. There we go. And if we go to one of the users with JavaScript disabled, oh man, it didn't work. Why didn't it work? This is a highly instructive example. I don't know how to solve this any more than you do. But what I can do is I can try Googling the error message. I tried this, Rails JavaScript degrade gracefully, invalid authenticity token. It's this here. And from this, top hit here is at Stack Overflow. You can see Stack Overflow works best with JavaScript enabled. So that's a nice confirmation that in fact JavaScript has been disabled. And this is in fact the same problem that we just run into. And the answer, turns out, is to put a configuration variable inside, where is it, application.rb. See if that works. Try this. Restart the web server. And let's see if this works. Let's try this now. All right, it degraded gracefully now. If we go back here to this, it still work? Yeah. All right, look at that. I'm glad I tested that. I just claimed in the book that it would work, but in fact, it didn't work. To be fair, that behavior is new as of Rails 4, apparently. But that's great. So now we've got working follow and unfollow buttons, both using AJAX if JavaScript is enabled, and using just regular form submission if JavaScript is disabled. Now that everything's working, let's write some tests to catch any regressions. We'll add them to the following test we made previously. Here it is. So let's test. Said it should follow a user. And should unfollow a user. And what we want to do is check both the standard and the AJAX ways. We can certainly do this the standard way. So here, let's say assert difference. And it should change the following count. We could do relationship count, but this is more specific. We can do @user.following.count. We have an @user from up here. It should change by 1. And the way to do this is to post to the relationships path, because it's a new relationship. And in order to get the route to resolve, we need a followed ID. But that's not true. This isn't for the route. This is because inside the relationships controller, we have this params of followed ID. So this is the params variable here. We can save this. It should be green still. Oh, it's red though. Define method ID for... Oh, right, because there's no other here. At other needs to be an other user, so let's put that in here. It'll just be our standard second user, Archer. So now this should work. Okay. And now I'm going to have the @ user unfollow the other user. So this created this following relationship. But I want to repost using Ajax, so let's undo that creation there. Actually, no, this is probably better to put in a separate test. It's a little bit of a kludge to unfollow inside the test like that, so let's do this the standard way. With Ajax. And Ajax is capitalized. Sometimes people write it all caps because technically it's an acronym. It stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. But in fact, even the original article that introduced Ajax as a technical idea spelled it this way. In any case, it's pretty easy to issue an Ajax request inside a test. You just do XHR and then the kind of request you want. Incidentally, XHR stands for XML HTTP request. We need a comma here as well. So this should work. Let's save it. Should be green. Alright. In fact, I typed this in, but I'm just going to copy and paste here. And this time I am going to remember to change the name of the tests. Should unfollow user the standard way. Should unfollow a user with Ajax. And here I actually need the relationship though between the users. So let's start with this. Let's actually follow the user, right? We're going to unfollow, so we have to say @user.follow. The other user. And then I want to delete that relationship path for that relationship. So go back to here. This is for unfollow here. This is a relationship path with method delete. Actually, we can just copy here. It's just this. And then we can say post to relationship path of relationship. Oops, and there are a couple of things that I needed to change there before saving. So this should be a difference of -1 because we're destroying one of these relationships. The user count should decrease by 1, and this should be a delete request. So let's see if that works. Alright, one more thing. So let's just copy these. And now instead of XHR post, it should be XHR delete. And we can get rid of this. Oh, there's still an error there. What's going on? Oh, it's relationships path here. It should be relationship path. But now we should be green. Ah, still red. Ah, because I forgot this. Okay, so close. Now it'll be green. I guarantee it. Yes. Rerun the whole test suite. Alright, so now if we do anything crazy like this, if we change this to, just get rid of this here. Save this, and this should go red. Yep. Alright, so that's great. This is a really nice test. It's so great that we can issue this XHR request directly, because you saw what a pain it was to test this in browsers, both using Ajax and using the conventional way. But this test does both, and it will catch very quickly any regressions. So that's it. We're now done with this basic machinery of following and unfollowing users, including both the standard method and the Ajax method. So the only thing left now is to change this home page, which right now it has this proto feed consisting only of a particular user's own microposts, to use a real feed with not only the user's microposts, but also the microposts of all the users that this user is following. Our strategy for approaching the status feed is to start with the proto feed we made in the last lesson, and then make a series of implementations of the working feed with steadily increasing levels of sophistication. Let's take a look at the mockup to remind ourselves of where we're going. Here's the micropost feed. So here, John Calvin is following both Thomas Hobbes and Sasha Smith, and so he sees their microposts in his feed as well as microposts that he made himself. Let's look at a diagram with a basic idea here of what the feed does. So this is a sketch of the micropost table. We've suppressed the content, which isn't important in this context. What is important, though, is the list of user IDs. So in this case, suppose we have user 1 who's following users with IDs 2 and 7, but not any of the other IDs here. Oh, sorry, 8 and 10 as well. So 1, 2, 7, 8, and 10, but not 4, 18, or 9. So what our feed needs to do is pull out the microposts of just these IDs, just the IDs of the user itself and the IDs of the users being followed. Although it's pretty difficult to implement this feed, it's actually really easy to test. So we're going to write a test first. And because the feed is attached to the user model, it'll go in the user test file. So that's this. We can put it here. And let's remind ourselves of what the data looks like. Actually, let's do this. We want users.yaml. And we also want to look at the microposts. And finally, look at the relationships. So let's pull out some of these users here. I'm going to pull out the first 3 in variables. This is Michael, Archer, and Lana. And so the feed should certainly include the post from a followed user. So let's look over here in the relationships. Let's start with Michael, who's following Lana. So let's say this is test for posts from a followed user. So each of Lana's microposts, which we can see here, there are 2 of them, should appear in Michael's feed. Let's say this is post from the following list, from user.following. We're going to assert that Michael's feed, so remember in the user model, we have this feed. It's just the proto feed right now. But we've got this feed, so we're going to say assert michael.feed.include this post, so post following. And we also want the feed to include the user's own micropost, so that's post from self. So michael.micropost.each do post self And this is the same assertion. Michael.feed include post self. And finally, we want posts from an unfollowed user not to appear in the feed. So in this case, if you look at the relationships, Michael is following Lana and Mallory, but not Archer. Archer is following Michael, but Michael is not following Archer. So if we say Archer.micropost, iterate over these microposts. This is post from an unfollowed user. Assert not Michael.feed include post unfollowed. Save that. Let's see, we should be definitely red. Some of these will pass, right? Because right now, these will pass. These assertions will pass. But this test will fail overall because Lana's microposts don't appear. So actually, both of these are passing now. These are here mainly so that if we make any errors in our feed implementation, this will catch those mistakes. So what's failing right now is these microposts, and then these are here just as a safety net. All right, we're ready now to start with the implementation. And I mentioned in the last lesson that we did micropost.where instead of just returning micropost because this will generalize more naturally to the full feed, and we're going to put that into practice right now. Let's take a look at a guess of the kind of SQL you might be looking for. Just going to put this in the Scratch area. So we're going to issue a select. We're going to select all microposts, so select all elements from microposts, where the user ID is in a list of IDs of the users being followed, or, actually it should be caps, just conventionally, or the user ID is equal to the current user's ID. In writing this, we're hoping that SQL supports something like this in keyword for set inclusion, and in fact it does. And remember, we're using the terminology following, so this is really the IDs of the users in the following list. So we expect something like this. I think something like this might work. So we need to make a list of the following IDs. Let me show you some ways to do that. Actually, let's go here to this console. Recall that we can use the map method like this. We can map over a list. I'm going to call 2s on each of these integers. Gives me an array of strings. We also saw there was a shorthand for this in lesson 4, so we can do map ampersand colon 2s. That just applies 2s to each element. And we can also join these, say on comma space. So it turns out this is exactly the form that we need for these following IDs. So we can do something like this, user.first, let's just look at one of the users. Pull out all the following, but these are all the users being followed. Just pull them out initially. So if we call .map colon ID here, that's just all the IDs of those users being followed. And this is exactly the list of IDs that we want for something like this. So we're thinking that maybe we'll have where user ID in followed IDs. So the way to do that is with this escaping we saw before. We want something like this, following IDs. This isn't going to work though, right? Because we need to build up this array. Except that this is so useful, Rails actually supplies it by default. User.first.following IDs. So in fact, all of that work was unnecessary. And this actually does have the following IDs. So if we save this, we'll get one step closer to passing. You can see the problem here is that in the query, we've got user ID in just raw IDs, but they actually need to be inside of parens. So let's do this. Now we've only got one failure, line 97, so it's here. So now it's just the post from self, and that's right. We need this here, this or user ID equals the user's ID. So we can say user ID in following IDs, or user ID equals question mark and then user.id. This won't work actually. I mean, it's pretty obvious it won't work if you think about it. Right, undefined local variable or method user. That's because this is really self. This is also self here. Let me just put it in. Right, over here we had, this is user.following IDs. This is just a user.first. So if we save this though, we're actually green. Right? This is a working feed. Get rid of the self dot. So this is just our best attempt at trying to think what kind of SQL query might work. And this actually built a working feed. In fact, in some applications, this implementation might be good enough. But it's not quite good enough for a site that gets any sort of real users. So before fixing that, see if you can figure out why. I'll give you a hint. What if a user is following 5,000 other users? What's going on here is that this is pulling out all of the following IDs, all of these, no matter how many there are. So there might be 5,000 if a user is following 5,000 other users. So the way to fix this is to use what's called an SQL subselect. And we're going to start refactoring this by changing the question mark to be a symbol. You'll see why in a second, why I'm doing this. So this now takes a hash, key value pairs, following IDs, colon, following IDs, and then user ID, ID. Save that. Still green. And now what we can do is replace this following IDs list with what's called a subselect, as I mentioned. So this is like this. We're going to select followed ID from relationships. Where follower ID is equal to colon user ID. So this is just a string now. This is an SQL string. But what this syntax here does is interpolates an escaped version of the value corresponding to this key, in this case user ID. So now we can replace this here. And this is going to make a query that looks like this. Select star from micropost where user ID in this subselect. Or user ID is equal to the given ID. So it'll interpolate these. This will be something like 1. This will be 1. So let's go over here and save it and see what happens. Oh, we've got a failure. Line 93. So now the posts from Lana are not being found. Let's tail the log to see what happened there. So we can see here that the actual query being executed has this raw :user ID. And that's because this here is now just a string, it's not an array. So instead of using this key value pair, we can actually just interpolate it directly into this as a string. Like this. And now it's passing. So now this arranges to put that set inclusion inside the database. Rather than pulling out all of the IDs, it makes a subselect that contains those IDs, and that's far more efficient. So this is it. This is a working feed. This will scale up pretty nicely even with thousands of users. Of course, if you ever reached a scale where you had hundreds of thousands or millions of users, you'd have to do something fancier than this. But this is quite good, and certainly serves our purposes well for now. So let's rerun the whole test suite. And there we go, everything is green. Our tests say this is working. Let's take a look at the app. Refresh it. And there we go. It's the feed of the users being followed. Check it out. So if I unfollow this user, now the feed shouldn't have that user's micropost anymore. There it is. Go to users here, unfollow, unfollow, follow, go back to users, refollow, looks like it's working. So this completes the sample application. It's now done. We've got this great core with the user sign up, log in, log out, account activation, password reset, and now we've added microposts and this social layer where users can follow each other. So let's deploy this thing to production, see if it works. Now we can push up. And deploy. All right, let's check it out. By the way, I mentioned here that there was a reason I put in this user ID rather than the question mark, and that's because it appears in two different places. So it's more convenient to use the key value pair in that circumstance. But in any case, it should be working. Let's take a look at it. Oh, that's right, we need to run the migrations. Let's reset the database. And now we'll run the migration and seed the database with the sample data. All right, let's check it out. And there we go. It's working. All right. Well, this is a major milestone. This is a challenging tutorial, and by getting to the end of this tutorial, you've gotten yourself a really impressive foundation in Ruby on Rails programming and web development generally. We've covered all of the major features of Rails, including models, views, controllers, templates, partials, filters, validations, callbacks, has many belongs to and has many through associations, security, testing, and deployment. There's lots more to learn, of course, and if you'd like a guide to further resources, take a look at the end of Chapter 12 of the Ruby on Rails tutorial book. But this is a great start. Congratulations.